Welcome to the inaugural episode of AssetSure's Leadership Webinar Series, Protecting Wealth. I am Rose Kurtz, Vice President of Business Development at AssetSure Group. Today, Tara Bramwell, Director of AssetSure, will be speaking with Brian Thornton, President of ProWriters. Mr. Thornton is a leading authority on cyber and professional liability risks and will discuss market trends and issues, vulnerabilities, and potential for loss, and what you need to be mindful of to better protect your client's wealth. We hope you find today's topic valuable in your client discussions.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk to you today.
Brian, let's start with your general thoughts on the cyber insurance landscape.
So, the current cyber landscape is that we saw a decrease in ransomware and data breach events in 2023. Partly, we think, due to the war in Ukraine and hackers being less focused on businesses over here and extorting them and more focused on attacking each other. And so we've certainly seen a refocus where they need to generate revenue. And so ransomware seems to have picked back up at the end of last year. And that seems to be continuing into this year. And so that and cyber crime related claims, which we could talk about a little bit, with those social engineering events, business email compromise events, tricking people into wiring funds out where they think they're paying a bill. There's a lot of kind of invoice manipulation and impersonation and trickery that goes into that. Sometimes your system isn't even compromised, but you do end up having one of those types of claims. So, we're seeing that. I think in 2021, 22, it was a bit of a hardened market, so pricing went up due to claims and loss ratios of carriers. Last year, we saw pricing really flatten out and come down in most cases. Certainly, I would say for small to mid-sized enterprises that are, say, under 50 million in revenue, I would expect that those types of businesses still have an aggressive marketplace that actively want to write their business. And so that's a little bit of what's been going on from a cyber perspective, cyber risk perspective, and in the insurance perspective. I think, the thing that we see a lot of is people that are underinsured, that think they don't really have an exposure when they really do. They think they have a small exposure when it is actually larger, and often it's some of the biggest exposures that businesses face. And they might carry, insurance on their office and their premises and their property, and thinking these are kind of some of their biggest exposures and they're important. But often cyber risk, if it goes underinsured, is something that could put a business out of business and certainly be severely damaging. And so the thing that we often see is people being underinsured, where they get a little bit of coverage in a BOP and they don't realize that's not really going to provide them the coverage that they need, even for small organizations. Ransomware claims, resulting data breach and regulatory piece, and the attorney's fees and the forensics fees, all these things start to add up, even if you don't pay a ransom. And so with that, I would just say it is important to focus on, and part of the kind of risk transfer is important, especially for small businesses, because a lot of carriers and MGAs now offer a lot of services and tools that come with the policy that can be really important. So that's some of what we're seeing in the landscape, but it is a dynamic underwriting, constantly changing appetite and landscape. And so it is something that you really have to stay on top of to know who's the right carrier, what are the right services and the right coverages for an individual risk.
Recently, I came across an article that was written in Business Week in 1994 that talked about the potential for hacks. At the time, in 1993, they had recognized only 50 cyber hacks or incidents, but it was up to a grand total of 1,200 by 1994. We're almost 25 years later, and the question I have for you today, Brian, is how prepared do you feel that companies are of various sizes to respond to a cyber incident? And also, what types of things should companies be thinking about and preparing for in order to be best prepared?
So I think, to be prepared is important. I think often for smaller businesses, one of the things they do is really the last thing is often the risk transfer piece. We see a lot of people that aren't necessarily prepared. They have some controls in place. They might have a managed service provider that is governing a lot of their controls for them, but they don't always have a lot of visibility into what they're doing or why or what they need to do to improve. And we see the reverse in kind of small, that often they buy a cyber insurance policy because they think they need to, or they were told that they have to have it. And so they go through the process, and often there is where they find they don't have certain controls that they're being asked about or show up in security scans. And so they might get that scan or get that response from a carrier and then be reaching out to their internal IT people or to a managed service provider that's managing that for them and say, hey, we don't have these things. How do we implement them? How much do they cost? What does this really do? And so larger organizations often have that as a larger internal function and are managing those things themselves and then building out more robust infrastructure as far as cyber risk. And so, at the end of the day, to get yourself prepared, you really should. There's a lot of free tools out there. And so I would say familiarizing yourself with this, understanding your exposure, and kind of being vigilant about it is part of it. And then with smaller businesses, again, part of procuring the policy often highlights the things that you need to do to improve, and also puts in place the risk transfer as well as the incident response, among other things. And so that is part of getting prepared, certainly.
Let's talk about recognizing an incident. How do you define an incident, and how do companies recognize when they've had an incident?
So we'll talk about defining an incident, but what I would say is often a lot of people find out that that there is an incident, not on their own, but a third party comes to them. Sometimes it's the FBI, sometimes it's other law enforcement areas, sometimes it's credit cards and banks, where they see a pattern of fraud coming through that all involve a certain vendor at some point. And they start to put together the patterns and say, okay, clearly there's been an intrusion at this entity because they all have some sort of involvement with it, right? It could be a payment processor. It could be somebody else, right? If all of your clients as an investment professional seem to be having issues, they might come back and say, hey, they're all using this firm. And they will then launch an investigation and have you start doing forensics. And that's where you might find, hey, we had an intrusion and a lot was going on that we didn't realize. And that's the first way that they find out. When it's ransomware, often it is you find out because on Saturday morning, someone can't log in and you look and everyone's locked out. If it's third party dependent business interruption, it's one of your critical vendors goes down and maybe you can't access your files, you can't access your systems, you can't transact, you can't execute trades, you can't get emails out. So it does vary. As far as defining an incident, I would say a cyber incident can be a few things, but it is often, when we're talking about data breach, it is some sort of intrusion where some third party gains access to personally identifiable information, personal healthcare information, or personal financial information. And so, that intrusion where someone gets access to that, the moment they access a file, that is when the incident occurred. You often might not find out about it until you've had an incident. Sometimes people can get into your network, but they might not necessarily access that information, where you don't have necessarily an obligation to notify, especially if that data was encrypted and they couldn't decrypt it. But that's one way where we would decide that was an actual incident. Ransomware would be an incident where you are a victim of a ransomware, you're experiencing business interruption. Those are kind of the moment that happens. That's an incident from that perspective. I think the other ones that are tougher are cybercrime, because they often start as part of a business email compromise. Sometimes that's not even a true intrusion. Sometimes it might be someone purporting to be your client saying, please go execute this trade, and you go do it. And it turns out they never said that. Or please make this investment, or please send me money. I would like to take a withdrawal, and can you send the money here? Here's the updated wiring instructions. And people don't call and verify and check. And the next thing you know, they've sent client funds out to a third party, or what they thought was that individual investor or institutional investor, and it turns out it didn't go there. So those are all, the moment you find out about that is really when there's been an incident. And then there's, within the policies, there's first party as well as third party coverage. And so that's why it definitely depends. And sometimes one incident will trigger both coverages. Typically it does. And so, when we think about this, it's just about, making sure that the company's prepared to be able to respond quickly to all these types of scenarios.
So if a company has not had an incident yet, what is the most surprising byproduct about what happens next?
I think the most surprising thing when people have never had an incident before, whether it's data breach or ransomware, is that even if they have coverage, often they cannot believe how time consuming that dealing and responding with these types of events is. This could take 1 or 2 months away from all your senior people within your organization, from the CEO down, take a lot, or if not the majority of their time away from their normal day job to dealing with this, to dealing with the attorneys, to dealing with the forensics, to dealing with customers, to dealing with regulators. And so it becomes extremely disruptive. And then if you look at companies that didn't have a policy, they don't even know where to begin. And so that is massively disruptive. But we've even seen this with people that do have a policy, that it's still extremely disruptive. And so, the process typically, assuming you have a policy in place, is that you would reach out to your carrier as well as a breach coach and or law firm that's provided by your carrier. And again, if you've been a victim of these types of events, the law firm, you're their client. It's not the carrier per se, but they do have panels of pre-agreed firms, and it's the best way to go to use them because they have dealt with thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of these types of incidents. They know how to work with each carrier. They know how to get the claims adjuster on the phone on a Saturday night to keep things moving along. And so, getting in touch immediately with the law firm is critical, because a law firm can then preserve attorney-client privilege. They can kind of quarterback what needs to happen. They are advising you every step of the way. They're making sure that you're notifying regulators in a timely manner and providing the details that need to be provided. So all of these things are important. And I think often they're the ones that potentially contract with the forensics firm on your behalf to preserve attorney-client privilege around what's going to be discovered. And then there's, as you notify the claims adjuster, they're probably working with them as they go to say, these are the things we want to do, and make sure that they're covered, or that the claims adjuster agrees with that process. Then it might be the law firm working with a PR firm to help respond and make public statements. So the law firm is always going to be critical. Sometimes it's called a breach coach. The other thing is, they really help you specifically deal with certain regulations, right? So the New York Department of Financial Services is an example where you've got 72 hours, to determine if an event has occurred. And so often ransomware events happen on a kind of Friday night, Saturday morning, usually over a holiday weekend. And so there's a lot of time that goes by where you're being impacted and you don't know it. And so, that's a little bit about that kind of process.
Let's talk about the insurance policy. What does the typical notification provision look like in an insurance policy? Do these notification provisions vary from carrier to carrier and form to form? Also, my other question is, have you seen any companies which have missed the notification provisions and been denied coverage?
So, the typical disclosure when you have an event is, most policies say you have to notify of an event and you have to do it as soon as practicable. There are the scenarios where you can notify carriers of what you believe is a potential event or a potential claim. And that's extremely useful. And we always recommend it because it doesn't damage you at renewal if you've reported a potential claim, especially as a smaller business. The carriers would prefer it, and we would recommend it because they often have, especially the sophisticated providers of this insurance, they often have the resources in-house to give you some guidance where you don't need to necessarily pull in a law firm, but you might get the guidance to say, okay, this is what we need to go look at and figure out, do we have an issue here or not? And so we often get called about that from agents and their clients, but often the carrier has their own resources or their own in-house incident response teams that can provide some guidance as far as what occurred and what you might need to do as next steps. All the carriers are slightly different, but almost all of them will say you have to report everything as soon as practicable, and you have to you may report a potential claim, which we recommend because you can engage their services often for free. But the forms are all non-standard, so it is all very different. But that tends to be the theme of all of these. Typically you've got to give them what you've got, but you don't always have all the information. And that's okay. I think it's fine to initially say, here's what we know so far, and this is what we're kind of doing, because they'll help guide you and say, well, these are things you should also be thinking about. But we've absolutely seen claims declined where people don't report them. They might think it's a smaller incident or below their deductible or retention. We've certainly seen people not report an incident that they think they've just dealt with and they didn't want to report. But it turns out that criminal that hacked their system was never out of their system. And so 6 months later, it turns into a much bigger event, a bigger fund transfer fraud claim or a bigger notification issue. And so the carriers now rights have been prejudiced. And if they'd reported this 6 months earlier, it would have been a much smaller claim. But by not reporting it, in those scenarios, often claims can be declined. So it is really important to know that if you have an event or a suspected event, that you engage your carrier, that you let them know, you put them on notice of at least a potential claim so that you're covered no matter what. So if it does turn into something 6 months down the road, that you've put them on notice appropriately, and that you don't potentially prejudice your rights to recovering a claim for insurance that you've paid for.
Given your experience, what would you advise companies to do today in the way of risk management?
So when we talk about risk management, there are some important things. Over the past few years, there was a big push to get MFA in place at multiple levels, right? From login to email and remote access to email to login to your network. Certainly, logins to backups and other critical functions as far as what your administrator would do. Those are all important and will continue to be important, but it's not the end all be all. And there are ways for sophisticated criminals to get around some of those things, especially if they're in your network and they control your email. One of the other things has always been a secure email gateway. Email is just an open way for people to get into your network and send you something that you might click on. And so having a good secure email gateway that blocks a lot of that known traffic from bad IP addresses is important. Segregated backups, whether they're cloud-based or air-gapped or offline, those are important because that measures how quickly you can get back up and running. And that is a component that carriers will take into account when they underwrite you. I think, those things are important. I would say the other thing is, endpoint protection. A lot of the carriers want to know about endpoint protection and do you have something? And most people don't understand what this is, or they think they have it because they have antivirus, which is not that. Endpoint protection is a tool that is critically important and becoming much, much more critical to either limiting claims, preventing them, but often limiting the damage of someone that does get into your network. So endpoint protection, if you think of companies like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne and Microsoft Defender, and there's others that provide these tools, it is software as a service that can be put onto individual endpoints. So think of all your company issued laptops, server, et cetera. It will monitor traffic, and it's often powered by AI and machine learning, and it is there to spot anomalies and then highlight them to an analyst, right? And so if you have something called MDR or managed detection response, you often are then paying an additional fee to have a human being that's there to monitor that. So some of the carriers are starting to offer that, which for small businesses, we recommend they take that from their carrier because while it's an extra fee, you could pay that to a third-party IT company, but if your carrier is doing it, that means that they're fully integrated and they have a vested interest in keeping your loss ratio down. So they would want to move it quickly to their incident response team to make sure that they're doing the right things and your carrier is notified in a timely manner. So that EDR, MDR service, sometimes it's also XDR, which is additional services as far as layering in multiple security tools that you have and being able to analyze those as well, are really important because if someone does get into your network, what they typically do is get in at one point and then they laterally spread. And as they do that, that's where they spot them and compartmentalize that and then restrict that traffic, get them out of your system. That often turns into a very small claim. It's where those bad hackers come in and they spread laterally and then they get higher level credentials and then they get into your database or they get into places where they shouldn't and start extracting PII, PHI, PCI, or encrypting it and locking you out and then hitting you with ransomware. So EDR and MDR have been critically important tools to really lower loss ratio. And we know it does. It is an added expense that a lot of businesses, especially smaller businesses, haven't done. I think the prices are coming down on this and the carriers are really focused on it and are willing to give discounts, maybe 10, 15% off your cyber premium. Very small business, it might be an expense, $5,000 or $6,000 for the year for your employees and you to have this on your server and your computers, but it drastically mitigates a potential claim. And that lowers your reputational harm and other things that you don't ever want to have to go through one of these events. And so that's one of the biggest things. And some of the other things we've talked about are just having DMARC and SPF and things like this on your email and on your website. It's just they're not the end all be all, but they do show that you're a little bit more sophisticated in the tools that you've got and you're taking the right steps. And so there is a tool that people can use. It's the GCA Cybersecurity Toolkit. This is a cyber alliance that is providing free tools to end businesses to evaluate the risk, to understand the risk, and to start putting tools in place to manage it. And so we highly recommend people look at that. It's often something that gets overlooked, but it can often be really good. And I think, policyholder tools also come with policies like, a Coalition, an AtBay, a Corvus, others. If you look at the tools that they're offering with their policy, it is often beyond what was traditionally there. So being able to scan you throughout the policy period and alert you as they find new vulnerabilities, they often then, as they find that, they then scan all their policyholders and then reach out and say, hey, there is this new vulnerability we've scanned and you have it, and here's how you go fix it. That's a really valuable tool to be getting with your policy that's included within your policy premium. And so those are all things that you should be talking about and understanding as you're potentially looking to buy an insurance policy and transfer the risk of the services that come with it.
In 2020, we learned of the SolarWinds hack. This brought more attention to supply chain oversight. What are companies doing to be more prepared in the oversight of their supply chain?
Yeah, so third-party risk is always big, and sometimes we might be the third party, and we might be a small company compared to the larger companies that we connect with via different networks. But it is important that anytime you're utilizing a third party for their software, their service, that you're vetting their technology stack and the controls they have in place and what they're doing. And so, SolarWinds is an example. That was software that MSPs use to network into their clients' computers, just like when you call the help desk and they can then log in and see everything on your screen. That was what the tool was used for, and hackers used it to get into a lot of clients and people that were using that software. And so, early in the cyberspace, that was always a concern of an aggregation event, that a intruder comes in, they get into an MSP, and then they get to all the clients. And that's why MSPs, tech E&O, and cyber insurance is pretty expensive because there's that worry that they get to all their clients, or at least many of them. Similarly, with vendor risk management, there are tools. You can use different scanning tools to look at vendors and get an external look at what you can see and how they compare and how they're scored to know that they're, have a reasonable security posture from an outside perspective. Those tools are valuable. Often, as a vendor, you might have been subject to those and been given a report, a BitSight report or security scorecard report that says, here's how we see you, and can you answer some of these questions about your controls? It is a big risk because you don't have great insight into third parties' controls. That's why it's always important to be using kind of verified third parties that are robust. And if they're not, you've got to dig in a little bit more to make sure that you're comfortable that if they had an event and it affected you, that they either have insurance themselves or that they'd be able to make you whole, or if they're less critical, you can have other potential backups in place to go around using that specific third party. But vendor risk has been and continues to be a big issue. It often causes large business interruption results from the third parties. So, there's one on the healthcare side where United Healthcare got hit, and all these pharmacies and hospitals suffered business interruption and claims processing issues because they couldn't get prescriptions processed. And that became, and is an ongoing event right now, a big issue called Change Health. So, that's third-party risk is important to be able to look at it and also understand that you might be the third party and people might be evaluating your security posture to see if they're going to work with you or not.
What would your advice be for financial services providers such as registered investment advisors, family offices, and others, and how they should proceed?
So, if I'm in the shoes of an investment advisor, a family office, a financial service provider, I want to make sure that if I did suffer an event, I'm prepared to respond. I would want to make sure that I have insurance. But part of that is because of all the services that come with it, that you get to utilize the best law firms, the best forensic companies, they're going to respond appropriately. But even pre-breach, I would make sure that I'm putting the expected tools in place. 5 years ago, MFA across the board might not have been expected. Now it really is. And so if it turns out you're the victim of an incident, a ransomware event, and it turns out through that report, it was because you didn't have some of these basic controls in place, that will come out in these reports, and it can cause bigger reputational harm that you were lax on your cybersecurity. And so, from a cyber risk management perspective, you should be looking at always having not always the latest and greatest, but what we know will really reduce, prevent, or mitigate claims. Right. So MFA, endpoint protection with MDR services enabled, critical, secure backups, segregated backups. Those types of things are really important. If you put those in place, you should be able to respond quickly. You You should be able to mitigate the damage to claims, mitigate the damage to your potential clients, right? That's critical from a reputation perspective if your clients are affected. If someone's using you to target your clients, often if you have clients that are either institutional or otherwise that have a lot of money, they're going to be a target and they might be using you to get to them. So you really want to be able to show at the end of the day, hey, we had really good controls in place. There was some human error. Someone clicked on something that got through. That's expected, that's going to happen every once in a while. I think it's deemed acceptable as long as you had decent controls in place, but then your response has to be good as well. And so having a policy all typically enables you to have a really robust response from the top vendors in the space that are going to make the experience on the back end for your clients, not make them leave you and go somewhere else, that they would understand it, accept it, and say, okay, the response was actually really good. And sometimes we see reputation is enhanced after this because the way it was dealt with in such a straightforward, forthright way, and that you responded quickly and accurately, you answered their questions, and it turns out you had decent controls in place. Often that really helps. So that's a couple of things I would just say, stay vigilant. The criminals are extremely crafty, and a lot of times, the one thing I would say is small businesses don't think they're the target. That's not really the issue. Often you are a target. It's just because they're targeting software with known vulnerabilities. And if you're utilizing a variety of softwares, they are often scanning for that vulnerability in software, not the specific company, and then targeting it, whether that's with malware, whether that's with ransomware. And so that it won't necessarily be that the small business isn't the target. It's the software vulnerability that they know about that hasn't been patched yet. So patch management's another thing we could talk about, but just keep those things in mind, and I think people will be in a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for joining us today and sharing your insights as it relates to cyber preparedness, proactive risk management tools available, and the best ways for our companies to be prepared when it comes to their supply chain oversight. We really appreciate you joining us today.